Well, since I mentioned this in the solutions, might be a good time just to kind of run through this idea if you've never talked about it. Why we can't divide by 0, but if we could, what we would get is an answer. So, good way to illustrate it, if I have a function 1 divided by x, because with the goal of trying to divide by 0. So let's see what happens if we get really close. So we know if we put in the calculator 1 divided by 0, it doesn't work out. So here's sort of a calculus way to think about this, and this is a good lead into what you'll eventually do in calculus. But it's something simple enough, and I can teach this to an Algebra 1 student, they get it just fine. So let's kind of try to get close to 0. Let's sort of kind of cheat a little bit. So I'll start with 1 divided by 1, but then I'll start getting smaller and smaller decimal numbers and see what the pattern is. And there's going to be a clear pattern come up. So try this out, and you can follow on through calculator, pause it, and check and see if you're getting it right. So if I put in 1 for x, 1 divided by 1 would be 1. Okay. Well, what if I put 0.1 in for x? Because 0.1 is a lot smaller than just 1. It's not really close to 0 yet, but it's definitely pretty small. Well, 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. Okay. And when you start putting enough zeros in here, you'll start to feel like, well, we'd probably round this to 0 if it showed up on the calculator. So it might get pretty convincing pretty fast. But if I did 1 divided by 0.01, I did 100. If I did 1 divided by 0.001, I would get 1,000. Okay. And I'm just going to make up a big one here. What if I put maybe 5 zeros and a 1 there? Now that's getting really close to 0. So before I write on the board, pause and think about what you think that might come out to be. So hopefully you start to see a pattern happen here. It was 1, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. So however many places you have after the decimal, that's basically how many zeros you end up with your number. And I believe I had 100 here a minute ago, but it should be 1,000. So if we've got 5 zeros and a 1, that should be 1,000,000. So now, let's get away from can we divide by 0, because the answer is, yeah, actually, you sort of can. Technically, no, but sort of. But the real thing here is, what would we get if we could divide by 0? So if we did divide by 0, what would we get? So what's the trend? If I put in more and more zeros here and get a number that's even closer to 0, what's my outcome? 1 divided by that number would be really close to what? So when you divide by a number that's getting closer and closer to 0, your output is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is getting to this idea of limits that we're going to talk a lot about this year, and that's actually where you'll end up for the year and begin on calculus. Limits is the beginning of calculus. It's all about what happens if we start getting really, really, really close to something that we can't technically get to. So we can see the pattern happening, hopefully. The smaller and smaller and smaller we get, or closer to 0 we get, then the bigger the output becomes. So if we could divide by 0, what would we get? I'm going to pause there for a second. Let's think about that. So if we could divide by 0, since the output's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, if we could actually get to 0, then we would actually get to infinity for the output.